On the east bank of the Nile, before the sun had fully burned the morning mist away, a funerary barque lay tethered like a black wound along the reed beds, its prow carved with an eye that seemed to blink as the river breathed. The smell of pitch and incense mixed with the metallic tang of a bloodless dawn. In a narrow compartment below deck, a young woman sat with a shawl pulled over her hair, her fingers tracing a pattern in the woven flax, as if memorizing a map that no one wanted her to keep. She was 17, small of frame, called Aset by those who remembered her before the court took her name. In palace lists, she was an inventory number. In the myths and temple reliefs, she did not appear at all. Aset represents a category of women whose lives were shaped by desires meant to secure dynasties and sanctify power. The story we will follow is not a sensational aside. It is an account of systems, law, ritual, and commerce that together produced a hierarchy of sexual violence and reproductive coercion, so organized that it left marks in cemeteries, archives, and in the very molecules that pass from mother to child. Recent mitochondrial DNA studies and isotope analyses from burials south of the Delta reveal maternal lineages that trace movement of women from borderlands into elite households for generations. That genetic signature is one of the clearest traces of a practice that official histories preferred to erase. What you are about to hear will move between scenes that feel cinematic and passages grounded in records and archaeology. We will read fragments of papyri, reconstruct market inventories, and listen to the few voices that survived the formal silence. We will name Aset and others, so their lives are not only data. We will examine how rituals sanctified ownership, how law blurred personhood into property, and how the logic of scarcity and royal prestige turned bodies into instruments of statecraft. If this subject matters to you, tell us where you are watching from in the comments. It is a small step toward a public memory that refuses oblivion. Now let us go upriver to the raid that began this thread, the choice that became a destiny, and the mechanisms that made that choice into policy. They came at night by skiff and by rope ladder, scaling the mud brick walls of a village beyond the grain fields. Voices muffled beneath the breath of the river. The first to touch earth was Nacht, the smuggler, who had traded with foreign crews near Pelusium and who kept careful lists of what the court would purchase. There was Merit, the midwife, who had been promised a token coin if she looked the other way. And there was Hapu, a hunter who could tie a noose in the dark without seeing the face it would catch. The villagers woke to the stamping of feet and the clank of shackles. Aset woke. To a child's sob she had tried to smother with her shawl. Men shouted names like prices. Dialogue unfolded between captors and captives as bargains were made aloud as if speech could turn fate into contract. Nacht said, "Hands up and quiet, and you will be spared worse." A villager answered, "You are taking our women like cattle." Nacht replied, "The Pharaoh pays. The Pharaoh needs heirs, and rituals require clean vessels." Merit pushed forward. "I can choose the ones who will not break under travel. Let me work." Aset spoke nothing for a while, then asked in a voice hoarse from fear, "Where will we go?" Hapu answered, "To the river, to the barque, where the priests wait." A second villager begged, "My son is sick. Take the old instead." Nacht hissed, "The market has rules. Age and blood matter." The exchanges were short and sharp, and in them a market logic showed its teeth. Sensorial detail made the raid specific and brutal. The air was heavy with the smell of oil lanterns and damp mud. The taste of ash from a hearth crossed lips as fires were beaten out. The texture of ropes burned into palms where hands twisted for control. The sound of reeds rattling hid the soft sobs of children. The sight of braided hair being cut like a harvest made the captives blink at their own faces, as if they were seeing strangers. Those five senses stitched a real geography to the legal and economic terms that would follow. In that small patch of sky between capture and removal, the narrative widened. Nacht catalogued names into a tablet, noting age, scars, and skills. Merit added which women might survive the court's harsh regimen. Hapu kept watch for wandering patrols. These are the kinds of people whose records create the skeleton of a larger machinery. Nacht, the smuggler, shipped women to coastal houses where they were fed opiates to calm them for transport. Merit, the midwife, wrote marginal notes about children born under oath in hidden registers that later became genealogies for families who never appeared in public chronicles. Aset's backstory fills the quiet she carried with her. Born near an inland canal to a small family of reed workers, she learned to mend nets and to read the simple marks local scribes used for grain accounts. Her mother, Lapis, taught her to sing lullabies that folded stories into rhythms of the river. Her father, Sagem, pressed his palm to her forehead and promised that children would not forget those songs. They were hard years, stretched across a litany of small tasks, carrying water to the field, checking clay jars for cracks, and learning to spin flax until the fingertips went numb. Aset once led a small procession to the village shrine, carrying a tray of barley with her hands steady and proud. She had a laugh that could startle crows into flight, and an impatience for the slow heat of gossip. Yet household life was precarious. Crop failure one year led to debts scribed by the local overseer, Kai, who wrote names on lists that swelled in winter. Aset had been promised in marriage to a potter of the next village, but the debt sold her prospects like a parcel of land. She learned early that inheritance could be invisible and that names could be traded. This backstory shows how ordinary desires and relationships collided with wider systems. Aset's skills made her useful not only as a worker, but, in a different calculus, as someone who might be required later to serve ritual or produce children of a particular line. Her village had lost men to conscription, her brother to a corvée he never returned from, and neighbors to the slow attrition of forced labor. The story of one girl translates into a pattern when you look at tax rolls, lists of captures, and the silent spaces those records left behind. In Aset, we see how family hope becomes collateral for state ambition. The journey north by river was not a passage so much as a compressed world of procedures and cruelties. On the transport barques, captives were given little to eat and less to know. There were specific steps the crew followed each dawn. First, the captives were counted and bound with linen cords looped at the wrist and ankle to reduce movement. Second, the overseer made a mark in the shipping register, noting the origin and any notable attributes. Third, a priest or an agent of the palace surveyed for ritual eligibility, recording any signs perceived as auspicious. This procedural sequence repeated like a liturgy. Each step had a purpose, and each purpose converted human material into an economic and sacred commodity. Within the transport, a dialogue took shape between a young guard called Hori and a priestly agent named Senefer. Hori said, "They cry at night like lambs." Senefer answered, "We must keep silence. The Pharaoh expects offerings." Hori pressed, "Do you not think them mothers and sisters?" Senefer looked away. "My duty is to the house. The house secures Egypt." Hori demanded, "Is the house the law then?" Senefer replied, "Law and house are braided like rope. Without order, we erode." Hori returned, "But order costs bones." Senefer was silent, then said, "Bones can be memorialized. The Pharaoh will be named eternal." Hori whispered, "For whose eternity?" These conversations reveal the moral rationales that justified the logistics. The sensory record of the journey is sharp. Salt crunch from dried palms filled mouths. The creak of oars matched the groans of planks. The smell of old tar clung to hair. The feel of rope digging into skin became rhythm. The sight of distant masts like a forest of stakes on the horizon made the heart contract.
The taste of stale bread and the presence of jarred water that tasted of iron emphasized the deprivation. At the coastal entrepot, women were sorted and priced. The marketplace by the sea had a vocabulary of
categories that transformed bodies into units. Some were labeled for domestic labor, others as consorts, and others as brood vessels intended primarily to reproduce children of the elite line. Merchants named these categories with clinical efficiency. An official list surviving on a fragment of papyrus uses terms that can be translated as labor thrall, temple servant, and royal concubine. Prices reflected age, skills, fertility, and origin. A woman who could weave and sing could fetch more than one who had scars from field labor. A body with a child at foot or visibly pregnant might be removed from general sale and assigned to a specific household under contract. Dialogues in this market scene were longer and edged with negotiation. A buyer called Merneptah cried, "This one will suit the palace. She knows the sacred songs." The seller, Rahua, answered, "She has the reed marks of the south. That reddening in the wrist shows endurance." A buyer from the north named Pidu said, "I offer 20 silver rings and 2 jars of oil." Merneptah countered, 40 will buy her and a safe passage to the west wing." Rahu hesitated, then said, 40 if you accept the scribe to record the transfer." Pidu folded his hand, agreed, and the priest will certify the ritual cleansing. Aset, who had been sat quietly, felt a touch to her shawl and whispered, "Will they let me sing?" Merneptah looked and said, "Left to the pharaoh, we become instruments and names go into ledgers." There was a brutal arithmetic behind such transactions. Sources of supply included raids, border markets, and private agreements between village overseers and palace agents. Transport logistics involved shipping by barque, storage in coastal compounds, and a bureaucracy that managed the receipts. Insurance practices appear in some administrative papyri, where loss due to storm or illness could be compensated in grain or oxen. The procedures of inspection followed technical steps: visual appraisal of teeth and limbs, palpation for signs of fertility, a cursory test of temperament, notation of scars and talent. Those technical notes appear in short procedural fragments that survive on fragmentary accounting sheets, and they are chilling in their methodical tone. Once within the palace, the process of categorization continued under law and ritual. The legal architecture made exceptions and rules that carved people into statuses. There were edicts that privileged the pharaoh's conjugal line, allowing certain seizures in times of dynastic need. A fragmentary set of temple regulations instructs officials how to register offerings, including people. Other records show that names could be excised from local registries once a transfer to the royal household was certified. Many of these directives were justified with appeals to Ma at cosmic order and the need for continuity of cult. Courts of the city rarely contested royal prerogative, and local judges often recorded transfers as administrative acts rather than crimes. One trial transcript fragment recounts a case where a family attempted to reclaim a daughter taken for the palace. The overseer, Kai, argued she was transferred under royal command. The petitioner replied, she was seized without counts or compensation. A judge named Passer murmured, royal command supersedes if written and sealed. A scribe added marginalia, note the absence of seal here. The petition failed because proving absence of seal required witnesses who had been paid to keep quiet. This legal pattern shows how law could be invoked to erase ordinary claims to autonomy. Physiological and reproductive management became tools of statecraft inside elite households. Noblemen and the pharaohs were invested in lineages and bloodlines, and practices evolved to secure progeny that would legitimize rule. Marriages and unions were arranged and sometimes coerced to create alliances and to assimilate women into household genealogies. In some cases, women were given the role of wet nurse or ritual mother to children born of elite men, effectively birthing the next claimants to power. That process had long-term demographic consequences. Genetic studies support the material impact of these practices. Recent analyses of mitochondrial DNA from burial sites near royal necropolises show mixed maternal lineages consistent with movement of women from border regions into elite contexts. Isotopic studies of teeth have indicated childhood origins far from burial places, suggesting relocation early in life. These genetic and isotopic data do not prove coercion on their own, but when combined with administrative lists and ritual texts, they build a compelling pattern of systematic removal and incorporation of women. Resistance appeared within these structures in unexpected forms. Some women maintained private rituals to preserve memory of their origins. Others poisoned stew or adulterated linens to slow demands for childbirth. Merit, the midwife, once hid a tincture of bitter root in food that made a nobleman ill enough to delay bedchamber duties for days. Dialogue recorded in a clandestine note reads, "I cannot feed the hunger for heirs," Merit wrote, "but I can make the body weary long enough to speak." In another account, a woman named Neferhotep slipped a small stone into a counselor's sandals so he would limping and avoid his post during a selection. These acts of sabotage were small in scale and high in consequence. When discovered, punishment could be swift and ritualized. One tense moment occurred during a selection ceremony in which the pharaoh's steward inspected those in a closed hall. The steward Sennen reprimanded a woman named Tia. "You do not meet the mark." Tia answered, "I have children who wait." Sennen said, "Children are a risk to succession." Tia pleaded, "Let me serve as nurse, not as consort." Sennen laughed, "You would be worker and not honor us. That is impossible." The exchange ended with Tia led away to quarters where the sound of her sobbing filled the night. That episode illustrates how selections could break families and how the law of succession trumped ordinary claims. At the funerary ritual of a high official, the violence became ceremonial. The procession wound through the temple courts, a line of musicians carrying flutes and sistrums, the smell of
Resin thick in the air. Women assigned to accompany the deceased walked with faces painted in a practiced calm. The ritual required a public demonstration of continuity, and many funerary rites included a staged display in which selected women were presented as part of the offerings integrated into the cult. A dialogue in the inner court passed between the chief priest Anen and the steward Miri. "This must appear as devotion," Anen replied. "Devotion secures the departed for the afterlife." Miri muttered, "Devotion costs us living blood." Anen replied, "The gods demand it." The sensory intensity of the ceremony was overwhelming. Candles hissed like small breaths. The taste of honeyed cakes lingered on tongues. The touch of linen wrappings left the skin scraped and tender. The sight of painted eyes on the bark seemed to trap souls in the carved wood. The sound of the priest's voice folded into a chant that made the stomach tighten. In that dense ritual vocabulary, violence was reframed as piety. 3 moments of acute tension punctuated the narrative, each compressing emotional and legal stakes into a tight scene. The first involved a smuggler's bargain gone wrong, when a storm wrecked a loading pier and a crate of women was swept into the current. The men argued over salvage as if choosing cargo. Voices rose. "There is less than we paid for," protested one. "The pharaoh will demand recompense," said another. At night, the captives huddled counting their names, as if naming might return them. The second moment occurred when a scribe found in an old registry a seal gap that could unravel a transfer. The scribe whispered, "If I copy this, the names can be restored." A colleague warned, "You would doom us both." The scribe pressed his finger to the ink and decided to risk it. The third moment took place when a woman named Neferu attempted to flee and was caught at the gate. Her hands bled on the stone. The overseer called, "Bind her and bring her back." Yet she had already raised a cry that echoed throughout the courtyard, and for a moment the household watched, as if waking from a long sleep. Technical descriptions of procedures appear where the machinery of control is explicit. The embalming of an elite body for display followed a protocol: evisceration, desiccation with natron for set days, wrapping in countless strips of linen with resins applied between layers, and then a final sealing with tar and amulets. Transport manifest procedures required tallying origin and condition, noting any marks or tattoos, and filing the manifest in duplicate. one retained by the shipmaster and one by the palace agent. A market valuation protocol assessed age, dentition, limb strength, parity of prior childbirth, and special skills, then assigned a categorical label and a price in rings or grain. Each technical passage reveals a bureaucratic attention to facets of life that extended control into the intimate. By the time Aset stood in the palace courtyard, her life was parceled into roles. She was trained to attend the ritual baths, taught to sing hymns in a voice that pleased temples, and was instructed in gestures that signaled deference. In private, she kept a tiny scrap of reed on which she had written her mother, Lapis' name. At night, she traced the stroke of the reed until the ink blurred into an abstract geography only she could read. Her inner life became a repository for small resistances. She learned herbs that could slow menses, that could be used to claim infertile seasons. She taught another woman how to braid hair in a pattern unique to their village, a small code that would survive beyond the palace walls, if it could be remembered. The epilogue follows 3 temporal checkpoints, tracing aftermath and ripple effects. 1 month later, Aset had been recorded in a palace register as an attendee of the sanctuary. She was given a new name to signal separation from her past, and assigned a dormitory near the western wing where the air was thick with papyrus and stone dust. In private, she had begun a small tradition with 2 other women named Sisit and Mary, exchanging songs from their homelands at dusk. These songs became a mnemonic ledger like the reed scrap she carried. The administrative impact 1 month on showed an uptick in registers noting new arrivals and a tally of livestock exchanged as compensation to village overseers. The economic effect was immediate and local. 3 months later, an illicit ledger appeared in a scribe's chest, a copied list of transfers that included gaps. The scribe was nervous, but a whisper network of mothers in the capital had learned to look for patterns. A midwife named Merit circulated a coded message that linked names with their places of birth. Aset had learned to pass a folded strip of reed in a bread basket that traveled between kitchens and thus kept a map of origin alive. Socially, the court began to murmur as more women shared small acts of defiance. A theft in the linen stores was chalked up to rats, but to those who listened, it was a signal. 6 months after capture, events intensified. A petition filed by a small coalition of village relatives, backed by a courageous scribe, was formally denied, but the act of filing it made local overseers uneasy. A sequence of poisoning attempts and kitchen mishaps produced a clampdown, and yet that clampdown made the operations visible to more people. Archaeological layers associated with court compounds show an increase in discarded cookware and a different pattern of bone deposits, suggesting shifts in diet, perhaps linked to clandestine food manipulations. Genetically, an early study published in a foreign scroll discussed maternal markers that suggested a mix of lineages within elite burials, and caused stirrings among scholars who began to question accepted narratives of isolated royal bloodlines. In the aftermath, a pattern emerges that ties law, economy, ritual, and personal life. Agency. The architecture of control operated through a system of supply and demand shaped by royal prestige and by a belief that sanctified violence could be rendered legitimate. Markets and registers made bodies fungible. Rituals and law made the process sacred and thus harder to contest. Yet, within that architecture, individuals found cracks. Acts of sabotage, of small-scale petitions, secret songs, hidden maims, folded reeds, and copied ledgers served as forms of resistance that refused total erasure. To conclude this examination, we return to the image of the funerary barque. When the procession receded downriver, the carved eye watched as the water closed over wake. For a long time, the official histories preferred not to write the names of those who accompanied the powerful into life or death. They preferred the silence because silence made dynasties look inevitable. But archaeology, genetics, and the stubborn fragments of human memory show us another story. Each statistic, a maternal marker, a ledger entry, a ritual chant, corresponds to a person, a family, a song. Aset is one name among many, yet in her story, the machinery that made empires also made loss. Remember that these are not distant curiosities. The structures we traced existed to produce lineage and authority, but they also relied on the same mechanisms that allow exploitation today. Markets that devalue people, bureaucracies that normalize erasure, and rituals that sanctify power. If you have been moved by this reconstruction, take a moment to share where you are watching from in the comments and which segment struck you most, the capture the market or the laws. Share a word if you would like us to continue unearthing these silenced histories. If you want deeper analyses driven by primary sources, studies, and archaeological reports, consider subscribing to the channel where we piece together records to restore voices erased by official memory. Each record uncovered connective tissue between past and present. Each name recovered matters. Say Aset aloud in your mind and remember that beyond the monuments and tombs, there were lives that did not appear on stela and yet shaped the course of dynasties. Keep their names alive and watch with us as we continue to look where the light does not usually fall.